Chapter 3. The Ring of Gyges. People do wrong whenever they think they can, so they act morally only if they're forced to, because they regard morality as something which isn't good for one personally. With Thrasymachus silenced or sulking, his case is taken up by Glaucon, a character identified with one of Plato's brothers, while the only significant other character, Adeimantus, is identified with a different brother. In the dialogue, they seem more or less interchangeable. Glaucon refines and adds precision to Thrasymachus's own scatter-shot attempt at saying what he means. First, he carefully separates the question of whether morality is a benefit in itself from whether it is only useful as a means to other ends. For instance, social acceptability, the result achieved by following the law of fashion. Socrates maintains both. So Glaucon tries to show that in fact people only practice morality when they lack the ability to do wrong, and seeks to show this by a story or thought experiment. A shepherd from Lydia, a part of Western Asia Minor, now Turkey, Gyges, is supposed to have acquired a magic ring that rendered its wearer invisible. Armed with it, he enters the royal palace, seduces the queen, kills the king, and usurps the throne. This is a highly satisfactory outcome from Gyges' point of view, so who wouldn't do the same? Suppose there were two such rings, then, one worn by our moral person, the other by the immoral person. There is no one on this view who is iron-willed enough to maintain his morality and find the strength of purpose to keep his hands off what doesn't belong to him when he is able to take whatever he wants from the market stalls without fear of being discovered, to enter houses and sleep with whomever he chooses, to kill and to release from prison anyone he wants, and generally to act like a god among men. In other words, separate morality from its effects, and you will see that everyone regards it as a nuisance, an annoying break on their freedom of action. Glaucon does not stop there, but presses the point with a further argument. Put side by side a moral person and an immoral one. Now strip the moral person of his aura, and give him a reputation for immorality, sufficient to subject him to all the punishments the law can inflict and eventual death. And imagine the immoral person clever enough to enjoy all the rewards that the appearance of morality gives, but with the added benefit of being able to profit from his immorality whenever he can get away with it. Clearly the second has the richer, more successful, better rewarded life. In Greek theology it is even suggested that the gods smile on him, since being wealthier he can offer them better sacrifices. Adeimantus chimes in, "We find that not a single one of you self-styled supporters of morality has ever found fault with immorality or commended morality except in terms of the reputation, status, and rewards which follow from them." The challenge could not be clearer. Show that morality in and of itself, and regardless of its consequences, benefits the possessor, and that immorality similarly harms him. For if this cannot be shown, the law of fashion is all that there is, and we have no answer to the Athenian envoys and their successors. The challenge echoes down the history of moral philosophy. In the 18th century, David Hume posed the same problem in terms of the sensible knave, who takes advantage of the gains of cooperation and convention within society, but stands ready to cheat on them when he can gain by doing so. Plato's thought experiment merely shows us someone for whom this cheating is made especially easy. From now on, we shall call this Glaucon's challenge. It might be ducked by playing the religious theme of life after death, with heaven for the good and hell for the wicked. But the hope of evading punishment, or of being given a bribe or bonus, even by a supernatural agency, and even over a long haul into eternity, is really irrelevant to Glaucon's challenge, as Adeimantus his brother insists. The whole point is that talk of rewards, either in this life or in one to come, is inadequate unless the rewards are of a kind that cannot possibly be achieved by immorality, or cannot be forfeited in spite of morality. We should act from principle, not from hope or fear, or, as Kant later put it, our moral motivation has to be pure, free from the calculus of self-interest. The topic is often described by commentators as that of justice in the soul. This sounds a bit precious, but the soul here is not a ghost in the machine. It is simply the person considered in respect of character, knowledge, and motivations. As for justice, I usually follow the modern tendency to prefer putting it in terms of the relationship between morality in general and the internal psychological harmony or discord of the agent. I shall therefore talk of the well-ordered or rightly ordered agent. The aim is to describe this right ordering or harmony so that it satisfies two conditions. First, it must correspond to the agent doing what is right, possessing the virtues we esteem, behaving well. Second, Republic wants to make the benefit to the rightly ordered agent apparent without invoking other benefits such as reputation or popularity. It is to be a benefit in itself. It is important to bear this dual aspect in mind. Glaucon would not be answered if Socrates simply described a tranquil or serene agent, for example. Tranquility and serenity no doubt benefit their possessor. They are pleasant states to be in, but they may have little to do with virtue or behaving well. In the myth, the ring of invisibility could have enabled Gyges to commit his crimes in serenity and peace of mind. As was suggested above, the Athenian envoys may have been serene enough about what they were doing. If there is a connection, it would need arguing for. Chapter 4. The Analogy. Wouldn't we say that morality can be a property of whole communities as well as of individuals? To meet Glaucon's challenge, Socrates makes the move that dictates everything that follows. He suggests that morality may exist in communities as much as in individuals, and that since communities are bigger than individuals, it may be easier to see what morality truly consists in by first studying them. By investigating the well-ordered community in which morality or justice or the right and harmonious ordering is found in the body politic, we can better understand it in the individual. It's a very attractive idea, but its success is bound to depend upon the kind of mapping that can be made from the body politic to the individual. For example, the question of whether a state is rightly ordered will be one about the relations between its members. So what corresponds to this in an agent? An agent, considered as a mind or soul, does not have members. As a person, at best I have qualities and properties. I think things, want some things, fear others, and so forth. But how do these different features correspond to the individual citizens within a community? If the correspondence is weak or fanciful, the comparison may not be much use after all. In general, it is useful to distinguish three parts of any analogy. There is the positive part of the analogy, the negative part, and the open ground in the middle, the part that may or may not make the analogy fruitful. Consider the classic scientific analogy between a gas and a container of bouncing billiard balls, which is the model at the heart of the kinetic theory of gases. The positive part of the analogy is that molecules, like billiard balls, have velocity and momentum, that their direction can change as they collide with the sides of the container that holds them, that they therefore exert force on the walls of their container, and that they can be more or less densely packed. The negative part is, for instance, that billiard balls are large enough to handle, are manufactured, cost money, and are variously coloured. None of these features is of any interest to the way the model is to be used, but neither do they constitute disanalogies that damage the point of the comparison. Open ground in the middle might be that billiard balls have a finite size, and that when they become quite densely packed, they bump into each other more than if they are thinly scattered. These features are just the ones in which the analogy directs us to think about, and that might prove suggestive and fruitful, as in fact they did. We should bear this in mind when we contemplate the utopian character of the Republic that Plato is about to sketch. There is no doubt that he himself is often taken to be the grandfather of utopian writings in general, the ancestor of endless visionary books about Arcadia, the Golden Age, the land of cocaine, the Garden of Eden, or the Islands of the Blessed. There are some plums in this pudding, such as Thomas More's Utopia of 1515, or Samuel Butler's Erewhon of 1872, but in general utopian writings have a bad image nowadays. They often sound weird, impractical, visionary, if not outright mad. It does not endear us, for instance, to H.G. Wells that he wrote at least 5 books sketching utopias, of which A Modern Utopia of 1905 is probably the only one remembered. We tend to respond better to books in which our fears have been realized and things have gone wrong, not books that articulate their authors' dreams and ideals, but ones which reveal and focus our fears, such as George Orwell's 1984. Hell is always easier to paint than heaven. However, the points just made about the use of analogy help to rebut the charge of utopianism. If Republic is read as presenting a thought experiment, it may not matter if there are unrealistic elements in it. They may be irrelevant to the point being made, and there is ample evidence that Plato does not care if his ideal community cannot actually exist. This does not automatically imply that he incurs the charge of irrelevant dreaming. For comparison, consider one of the most famous thought experiments in the history of science. Faced with Aristotelian theory that a heavy body falls much faster than a lighter body, Galileo asks us to imagine a falling weight in the form of a dumbbell, two heavy ends connected by a thin bar. Now imagine the bar becoming progressively thinner, until it is a mere wisp, and then imagine that it is finally severed completely. Is it really credible that the resulting weights suddenly slow down at this last moment, when they cease to be one and become two, with a jerk? Now, it is irrelevant to the power of this thought experiment to protest, for instance, that nobody could fall alongside the dumbbell for long enough or with control enough to effect the final snip, so that the scenario is impractical. Similarly, it may be irrelevant to the purposes for which Plato is using his thought experiment to protest about impractical elements in the design of the community. It all depends on what the positive analogy tells us about the open ground in the middle. So let us return to the comparison with our minds. A mind can be thought of as a composite, an aggregate of features just as a city is an aggregate of people. It can be thought of as modular, like a Swiss Army knife, in which different tools do different jobs. It can be thought of as integrated or harmonious, or by contrast fragmented and disorderly, just as a city can be. So Plato has an ample starting point, a positive part which gets the analogy off the ground. And in fact, the modularity he is going to rely upon is not at all complex. He sees the soul as built from faculties, just as the city contains different classes with different kinds of job. As in the famous image of the charioteer from the Phaedrus, the soul is thought of as tripartite. There is the charioteer, reason, attempting to control the two horses, which we can label desire and spirit. The correspondence is with three classes in society. The ruling elite likewise controls the auxiliaries or military wing, and the shoemakers and the rest who produce the goods and services on which the city relies, the artisans. Obviously, there is an ample negative part to the analogy as well. In a state, some citizens are rich and some poor. They relate to each other by trade. But nothing in the mind counts as the wealth of an individual faculty or feature, nor can we well imagine one faculty, reason, say, trading with another, such as desire. But this negative analogy may not matter. It will hinge on whether the open ground in the middle proves fruitful, and that must wait on the development. Hence, we should neither embrace the analogy uncritically, nor dismiss it at the outset. Everything will depend on how the comparison unfolds. Socrates believes that communities are formed when people find they are not self-sufficient, but have requirements that involve the assistance of others. For a group or community to be effective, it cannot be that everyone does every job. There has to be specialization if things are to be rightly ordered. In individual arts and crafts, there will be only some people who know what to do and when to do it. There will arise mechanisms of exchange, internal and external trade, and gradual expansion as people's wants expand and specialists become capable of meeting them. But with expansion comes encroachment on neighbours' land, and with that comes war, requiring yet another specialization, that of the military. With this comes the need for government, the need for the guardians or the ruling elite. These have one specialist function, the management of the community. They are the custodians of the community welfare. They require a special combination of abilities. First, they will need to be courageous, passionate, and strong. However, they should really behave with civilized gentleness towards their friends and neighbours, and with ferocity towards their enemies. Otherwise it won't be a question of waiting for others to come and destroy them. They'll do the job first themselves. At first sight these are contradictory qualities, but Socrates reminds the audience that domestic farm dogs, for instance, are bred for just this combination of gentleness towards friends and flocks, and aggression towards things that threaten them. The combination also requires knowledge. The farm dog can tell its friends from strangers, and the ruling elite need to do something similar, for which they too will need education. To us, there is an obvious split between the military and the political. Military rule is one system, but not the best. For Plato it is not so clear. When he introduces his idea of the rulers, the famous guardians, he seems to blend the two, requiring a member of his elite to be both passionate, quick on his feet, and strong, military virtues, and also to have a philosopher's love of knowledge, a ruler's virtue. It rapidly becomes clear, however, that what really matters to Plato is the function of protecting order in the state and sustaining its stability, the job of the ruling elite. Later on he does split the elite into two. There are the real ruling class, who eventually turn out to be philosophers, and purely military or policing functions belong to the next class down, who are called auxiliaries. They are told by the elite what to do. To us this makes it a bit odd that at the beginning the real elite had to be strong and passionate as well as capable of ruling wisely. We don't expect our political class to be good shots and fast runners. They have enforcement agencies to do that for them. But Plato seems unable to bring himself entirely to separate fitness to rule from military prowess. Greece was not very far from its heroic age. Socrates' popularity seems largely to have stemmed from his awesome fortitude as a soldier. So far Socrates may seem to have given a perfectly plausible story about the evolution of civil community, but beneath the surface there are currents which may already make readers uneasy. For example, he holds both that it is impossible that anyone should be suited for more than one task, and that the state or community has the right to prohibit anyone who tries, such as a shoemaker who tries to farm or weave or build. Good order, for Plato, implies a principle of specialization, or principle of single-mindedness. Shoemakers make shoes, and rulers rule, and this can be enforced by the collective. It also determines the kind of education different people are to get, as we shortly see. Even worse, the differential breeding and education of the ruling elite is already foreshadowed. In short, an authoritarian, perhaps totalitarian tone can already be heard. The question of how much this matters completely divides Plato's critics from his admirers. The view that republic is little more than an apology for the totalitarian state was voiced in Britain in the 1930s and 1940s, when the rise of Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union made totalitarianism a matter of some anxiety. The charge was put fairly mildly by the left-wing Member of Parliament and classical scholar Richard Crossman in his book Plato Today, published in 1937, and much more forcibly by Sir Karl Popper in the first volume of his three-book classic of polemics, The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in 1945. Plato is there seen as the direct ancestor of Nazism, Stalinism, and any other system that subordinates the individual to the collective. He is also seen as the dangerous, utopian social engineer, providing blueprints for improvement regardless of the messy and recalcitrant nature of the human material with which he has to work. The intemperate nature of Popper's attack in particular led to energetic rebuttals from the succeeding and contemporary generation of Plato scholars. There are two main lines of defense. The first stresses that Plato is not offering a blueprint for anything. Socrates several times says that neither the perfectly moral person nor the imagined community which is to provide a model for him need exist. It does not matter whether it is even possible that it should exist, or whether it is purely a thought experiment. The second defense reminds us that the political philosophy of republic is subordinate to the moral philosophy. The political descriptions are there in order to help answer Glaucon's challenge. Morality, right order, or justice in the state is the magnifying glass with which we can see those things in the individual self. So features of the state that might offend us, such as its coercive power over its members, need not do so, if they drop out of the analogy when it is put to use. The first defense can only get us so far. Let us agree that it is perfectly in order to sketch an ideal without caring whether it is or can be realized. This is not pointless fantasy. Ideals can motivate us. We can work towards them, trying to model ourselves or our community on them. We can use them as a rule or template with which to judge how far short we fall. They can inspire us. But Crossman or Popper can then put their objection in exactly those terms. Look what happens when you are inspired by the totalitarian, authoritarian, collectivist ideal. You get Hitler and Stalin, either of whom might themselves have invoked republic as their blueprint. Even movement towards Plato's ideal state tramples on values of democracy, egalitarianism, and freedom. Far from providing an ideal, Plato has provided the road to a nightmare. This reply is right as far as it goes, but remains far from conclusive. It all depends on what movement towards an ideal is supposed to be. The vicious dictator, preying on both his own people and on neighbours, may not represent a step towards the society Plato is imagining. He is not a step towards the human equivalent of the well-trained sheepdog. Neither Hitler nor Stalin has made the first step of ascent towards the character that alone qualifies someone as a ruler, and there is much more about this to come in Republic. Their radical, ghastly imperfections mean that nothing they could provide by way of government counts even as a move towards good order, the rule of morality in the state. That is indeed why Popper can terrify us by invoking them. It is why we fear them so much. But it also means that one cannot cite their infirmities as an objection to the ideal state of Republic. This reply works, but at a cost. It is indeed true that Hitler represented no kind of candidate for Plato's ruling elite, but the authoritarian or totalitarian state clearly shares many features with the ideal republic. If, simply in virtue of those features, we find it abominable, then the whole plan of republic is compromised, unless indeed these features can be regarded as dispensable. This leads to the second defence, which reminds us that the political is only offered as a magnifying glass. When we look at right order and morality in the soul, incidental features of the political state may drop out altogether. And perhaps among those incidental features are the ones involved in democracy and liberalism, and which appear to be threatened as the Platonic state develops. To take a crude example, it may be quite impossible to see what in an individual moral agent would count as there being a voting procedure or no voting procedure among the members of a body politic. In that case, the absence of such a procedure in Plato's state would be no obstacle to its intended use as a signpost to what would count as right order and morality in an agent. When Plato talks of coercion in the body politic, this rings alarm bells. But if the analogy is with self-control in the individual mind, then perhaps it need not do so. Self-control in an individual may be good, where control of the individual by the collective is not. This reply is also correct as far as it goes, but it also gives rather a lot of ground, more than many Platonists would like. Used indiscriminately, the defence only works by undercutting the value of the analogy in the first place. More than that, it is hard to believe that Republic has nothing interesting to say about politics. And it is impossible to accept that Plato's construction is as tight as is here implied, as if everything is and remains subordinate to the business of meeting Glaucon's challenge. Plato relishes the details of his state, and gives far more of them than he can transport back into the analogy with the mind. For example, some of the most notorious proposals to come concern property ownership and distribution, the equality of the sexes, eugenic policies in which the rulers lie to people about whom they may marry and when they may copulate for the sake of improving the race, and even the banishment of artists from the state. But how can those be part of the positive analogy? How would we model them in the well-ordered mind? I myself may or may not be a paragon of virtue, but insofar as I am, it can't be because some part of me, such as reason, possesses no property, or educates another part, the women, in the same way as the men. It cannot be because one module or feature lies to another about the right person with whom to have a baby. These features belong to the negative part of the analogy. We cannot transport them across to gain any illumination about the individual mind and what would make it just or well-ordered. Hence, when we find Plato devoting pages to them, we must suspect that the politics has taken on a life of its own. Glaucon's challenge is, at least temporarily, shelved. We remain entitled to worry about things in the ideal republic that strike us as off-colour. One of these follows immediately. Chapter 5. The Elite and the Artist. So it follows that were a man who was clever enough to be able to assume all kinds of forms and to represent everything in the world to come in person to our community and want to show off his compositions, we'd treat him as an object of reverence and awe and as a source of pleasure, and we'd prostrate ourselves before him. But we'd tell him that not only is there no one like him in our community, it is also not permitted for anyone like him to live among us, and we'd send him elsewhere, once we had anointed his head with myrrh and given him a chaplet of wool. Plato has a simple objection to many poets, which is that they tell lies about the gods. As I write, the Islamic world is in uproar, synthetic or not, over some cartoons mocking the prophet or his legacy, so the idea is hardly unfamiliar. In Greek myths, and in Homer himself, the gods take on different shapes. They are a pretty rough bunch. Zeus, the top god, is prone to rape and to what we would call paedophilia. He constantly cheats on his wife, Hera. The gods scheme and interfere with each other's plans. They are deceived and deceiving, prey to human passions like lust, anger, jealousy, and envy, and are generally portrayed as carrying on much as people do. Plato is shocked by this on two counts. First, the gods are presented as less than perfect. And second, and perhaps more importantly, they are presented as changing. It is here that Plato first strikes a note that becomes central later. Since the divine nature is perfect, it cannot be changed by external agency, but equally, it cannot change itself without changing for the worse. Plato does not consider the possibility that God may change from one perfect state to another just as perfect. He thinks of perfect as meaning uniquely perfect, not first equal. It is equally impossible, then, for God to want to change himself. Since, as we have found, the divine nature is as perfect and as good as anything could be, then any God retains his own form in a uniform, direct fashion forever. This is the pregnant principle that whatever is truly good is unchanging. For the moment we simply note it, but it has incalculable consequences, including the deep and dark theory of knowledge in the central books. Plato returns to the banishment of the artists in the last book of Republic, where his case is filled out by material from the central books. Here, earlier in the work, his focus remains the mutability of artistic representation. Not only do the gods change, but there is also the poet's ability to conjure up different characters with different thoughts, and the actor's ability to portray them in dramatic representations. Art is mobile, and representations shift and change. It is wild and free. Plato's leading objection to this is the principle of specialization that we have already met, the principle that regards each person as good for one thing only. A good man, then, voices good thoughts, and cannot be skilled at voicing the thoughts of a bad character. This claim will probably strike most of us today as pretty silly. We cannot infer back from the character of Iago or Hamlet to the character of the actor playing them, nor to the character of Shakespeare who puts their words in their mouths. Even if we are mildly attached to a principle of professional specialization, in amateur dramatics we are not surprised if a shoemaker can act the part of a farmer. We might be more surprised if he could not. But in Plato's mind something sinister remains, as if we called the theatre magical but gave the world its full disturbing weight. Perhaps rather than saying that he bases his view on the principle of specialization, we might call it a principle of purity, a monolithic view about integrity in the self, seeing pure, unspotted integrity as inconsistent with even the temporary ability to act or voice anything other than its own nature. This may not be quite so alien to us as it sounds at first. There is, after all, something uncanny about the capacity to enter into the minds of others, so perhaps there is a grain of truth to the principle of purity. Enough at any rate for us to understand comedian W.C. Fields's remark, "Show me a great actress, and you've seen the devil." Nevertheless, the idea that drama is so bad for actors that the community ought to forego the pleasures it provides probably struck Plato's readers just as much as it strikes us, as more than outlandish. We can sympathize more with Plato if we transpose the idea, wondering not whether artists should be banned, but whether there is a need to ban dramatic artistry from the elite. A canker in the community that particularly frightened him was, if the people who guard a community and its laws ignore their essence and start to pose, Other translations simply have them believed to be seeming to be guardians when they are not. Here, I expect, many of us give a shiver of recognition. We can all name posing guardians, and share Plato's view that they can destroy the community. Anything that encourages posing in public life, or leads those in public life to become skilled at posing, is a threat. We hope for purity. But again, it is not so much acting ability that worries us as insincerity. The first is only a problem insofar as it conceals the second. Before we mock Plato, we may also reflect on our own consumption of art. The average American 18-year-old, it is said, is likely to have watched something like 18,000 murders on TV. Although social science finds it almost impossible to speak with one voice about anything, there is good evidence that this relentless diet not only desensitizes young people, but makes them more fearful, and for that matter, more stupid. Dramatic representations give us patterns which we can follow, and then the question of how far children or grown-ups do follow them is an empirical one. Studies appear to vary, and no doubt the contagion varies with many different factors, but it is hard to believe that there is none at all. Perhaps Plato is right, and our minds are imitative, in which case the doings of other people and the nature of other minds are also contagious. We cannot patronize Plato from a position of wisdom or success in knowing how to feed people's minds. If he were to talk not about the exile of the poets, but the exile of the entertainment executives, he would find a more sympathetic hearing. We are much more inclined to worry whether people's minds can be harmed by too much exposure to what is bad, than to hope that they can be improved by a monocultural diet of what is good. But totalitarian states have indeed tried to control the imaginations of their subjects, by censorship and by promoting only an official art in which nothing is depicted except the virtuous labours of the proletariat or the happy unity of the people in the relevant utopia. We tend to find the art dismal, and the ambition fairly laughable, but living as we do in a world of mad fanaticism and routine incivility, even liberals may wonder if freedom has tipped into license, and we have gone too far. In other dialogues, notably Phaedrus and Ion, Plato associates artistic inspiration with divine madness. Beautiful poems are not human, not even from human beings, but are from the gods. The sentiment is at first sight flattering to the poet, and became a staple of Romanticism. It is the basis of Shelley's A Defence of Poetry, where the divine inspiration substitutes for reason as the measure of the ascent of the soul, and this in turn inherits centuries of Christian appropriations of Plato, equating the inspiration that is the goal of the soul's ascent with mystic union with God. But as we shall see in more detail later, it is not true to Republic, for which there is still ambivalence in the air. In Ion, divine madness, possessed by the orator and reciter of verses, is expressly contrasted with knowledge which is the true result of Plato's own drama of ascent. Indeed, the dialogue ends, ironically, with Ion encouraged to preen himself for being inspired, and not too bothered about the fact, which Socrates has established, that he does not know anything of what he is talking about. In Republic, the goal of the soul's ascent is unambiguously knowledge, not rapture. We could even see Plato at this point as being on the side of the reality-based community. For being carried away may be in some sense a divine state, but it is not the state of someone who is telling it how it is, or who is to be trusted or followed. We only have to think of the endless ills inflicted on poor humanity by orators, charismatics, seers of all kinds, in order to share Plato's mistrust. Politicians may all be bad, but visionary politicians with holy righteousness draped around them are the worst. We may also feel rather differently about the banishment of the artists if we return to the idea that the well-ordered state is a model of the well-ordered soul. Perhaps the truly well-ordered mind would not have the capacity to enter into the doings of the fallen. In a poignant moment towards the end of Othello, Act 4, Scene 3, Desdemona asks the more worldly Emilia if there can really be women who would cheat on their husbands, the implication being that her purity is so complete that she finds it hard to credit that there could be. If the analogy is between the presence of artistic representation in the state and the presence of vivid representations in the mind, then Desdemona is an example of Plato's ideal. She can truly say, as it were, that the thought never crossed my mind. True, her purity has something inhuman about it. We might be inclined to scoff at the idea that it is ever found, human nature being what it is. But this need not bother Plato. He is talking of an ideal of purity, not the fallen human nature we see all around us. He is talking of a kind of saintliness. The elite, then, must be brought up on a monocultural diet, only acquainted with the fine and the good. They are innocent of bad things, and that includes being innocent of representations of bad things. There is no value in any expansion of their imaginations in that direction. This may still strike us as off-key, and the reason connects with the absence of sympathy in Plato's conception of the virtues. We might think that, however saintly Desdemona's innocence is, a gentle induction into the way of the world such as might be provided by drama and fiction would be an improvement. It would enable her to understand and sympathize with a wider range of human experience. It would also have enabled her to understand what was wrong with her husband in time to avoid the catastrophe. If Plato's ruling elite are brought up so that they literally cannot understand cowardice, disloyalty, greed, jealousy, and the whole range of human dispositions, then it is hard to see how they are going to be much good at ruling. This uncovers a fundamental divide between the classical aesthetic and the romantic world view. Classicism insists on a complete separation between good and evil, beauty and ugliness, light and darkness, reason and passion. The good person is on the side of the one and has as little as possible to do with the other. In contrast, the Byronic soul, the romantic hero, experiences everything. He is acquainted with crime, passion, and darkness. Christianity is ambivalent about this. It maintains an ideal of purity. But in the myth of the fall, Christianity insists on the double nature of man, and Romanticism follows it. The moral reason that God comes to earth in Christianity is to share in human weakness. The very reason why Plato's embodiment of the ideal, whether in political or moral terms, must keep away from it. It is very hard for us to imagine how, by keeping away from it, the guardians can be anything human, let alone ideal exemplars of humanity. Republic's preoccupation with the education of the elite continues through some rather tedious discussions of which kind of music should be allowed then, and which kind of diet. They must not concentrate exclusively on physical sports, or they become brutal. The elite should avoid hypochondria, and confine their listening to something rather like military bands. The details are of little interest, but in each case the same principle of purity is involved. The best is not to be contaminated by the worst. Proportion, orderliness, and lawfulness must permeate all their experience. This does not, however, mean that the state must legislate for every nuance of behavior. Order flows naturally from the right, pure, uncontaminated education. One of the attractive things about Republic is that Plato insists on the supremacy of education over law. If a society finds it has to issue anti-social behaviour orders to whole sections of its young people, the British government's current strategy for improving them, it has already lost.